Hey, we're going to take a break in our regular programming because I just read today that yesterday was the 100th birthday of Shirley Jackson, who is one of my favorite short story writers. We are going to read a short story by her called Lord of the Castle that actually was not published until 20 years ago. She died in 1965, 51 years ago. Here is a picture of the cover of the book. And so, perk up your ears. It's time for a short story, Lord of the Castle, by Shirley Jackson. Hopefully one video, possibly two. It was a black winter's day when I watched my father hanged. I stood 15 years old, but too proud to show my fear before the villagers who crowded around, and watched the man I adored ascend the scaffold and take his last look at the sky and the trees and the mountains he loved. In that ignorant little village, the punishment for witchcraft was death, and not even the lord of the castle on the mountain top was great enough to stand against the law of superstition and dread. And so my father stood today before the hatred in the eyes of the villagers, and went gallantly to his death. As I stood there alone, I could feel the secret glances that followed me, and I could almost hear the whispers, "That's his son. That's the young one. Yonder goes the boy who inherits the devil's lore." And I hated them all for their ignorance and fear. And when they brought my father out to walk the steps to his death, I came forward to stand beside him before he mounted the scaffold. I looked deep into his black eyes, haunted by the sight of things no mortal had ever seen before him, and I stood as straight as I could, and I said to him clearly, "I know you are unjustly accused, Father, and those who have done it will suffer at my hand." But he looked at me and smiled and said, "It is not well to return death for death, my son. Rather hope that I shall rest quietly and leave you in peace." And he touched my hand to his head and took his great signet ring from his finger and put it on mine. Then I stood watching him climb up through the platform, and as one man close to me cried out against my father, "Go back to the devil, your master," I cried, "Quiet!" and lashed out at him with the whip I carried, and the crowd moved slowly backwards, sullen and muttering, while I stood alone beside the scaffold. But I could not turn my eyes away while my father died, and I would rather have died myself than show myself before the eyes of that crowd a coward. And afterward I rode alone, back up the hill to the tall dark castle, mine now, my home, and the home of my vengeance. At 15 I was the lord on the hill, and the possessor of such wealth in gold and land and antique treasures as would make me a success in any world's capital. I chose to frequent. I chose none, however, for my heart and my passion, and the wild, long history of my name held me to my home, and the home in which my father had lived and died. I wished never to lose sight of that long black line against the sky that met my castle on the hill, and too my promise to revenge my father's death held me to that place. Many days and nights I spent there alone, reading my father's books and studying his knowledge, with only an old dumb man moving quietly, who moves more quietly than those who cannot speak, about the darkness, bringing me what I needed, and turning the world from the door. It was vengeance I was studying, and a means for it, for I was bound by that very devil lore that had killed my father, to turn it to bringing his murderers to justice. And soon it was almost a year, and I still knew nothing, and was no closer to my heart's desire. And it was a year to the day that I sat in the garden, hidden below the crest of the hill by the heavy stone wall, safe, I thought, from any watcher. I was reading, and no footfall disturbed my work, but a voice spoke at my elbow. Is this not part of my garden? It spoke, and I leapt to my feet. The book fallen on the ground before me, a tall and slim young man, ragged and tired, with but a hint of my family in his half-closed eyes. "Who are you?" I demanded of the stranger, and he laughed. "I am your half-brother," said he. Then I laughed, but I fell back before the look in his eyes, so much my father that I feared him. "Your father had more than one son," he said, and touched the signet ring on my hand with the tip of his finger. And when I moved my hand away, he laughed once more. Then he was sober again, and his eyes were kind, as he watched me. "Our father," he said, "gave you his ring, because I am afraid that I had no legal right to it." Yet, then I understood. You are the son of some poor country woman whom my father... It was delicacy that made me pause, but he laughed still more. "I am," he said. I felt a great kindness growing in me toward this poor unfortunate. "I owe you something, then," and he nodded idly. I offered him sanctuary in the castle for a day or two, until we could decide what I should do for him by way of reparation for my father's unfortunate legacy to him, and together, almost arm in arm, we walked into the castle from the garden, and through the dark hallways, I, the lord of the castle, he, the beggar hoping for assistance, and we passed down the long hall from whose sides great dark portraits looked down, portraits of those who had borne us and cherished us and given us our common life. Then, in the chamber where old Joseph had kindled a fire and set out supper, I turned to my companion and bid him be seated and eat with me. "First tell me," I said, "what do they call you?" For a long moment he stared at me from under his lids, and the firelight made his eyes sparkle. "Nicholas," he said. "Good." And I waved him to bring his chair nearer the fire. As we dined for the first time together, he told me strange tales of wanderings and seekings, of far lands and places that existed, I was certain, in no country but that of his moving mind. He talked of wonders he had seen, of princes he had met, and queens, and I let him talk, half listening and half wondering what part of this queer half-brother of mine could play in the plans I was making, for I needed help. Of that there was no doubt, and perhaps this was my help, sent to me, as it were, from my dead father himself. So when at last the fire was growing dim, and he had silenced himself with talking, I said to him, "Do you know how our father died? He was hanged. Were you there?" "I saw it." As he spoke, he looked into the fire, as though seeing it again. "I have committed myself to vengeance upon my father's murderers," I said. "I promised him as he died that they would suffer." Nicholas looked at me suddenly. "But he bade you forget his death, so that he might leave you in peace." I shook my head, gazing in my turn into the fire. What secret faiths it held for us that night! By my father's death his work was broken and destroyed. By revenging him I shall recreate that work, and follow my father's dearest dreams. Nicholas frowned. "But you cannot help your father's work by harming a few blind villagers, or even by wiping out the village itself." "I could have put the village in flames, and the villagers into ground a year ago, had I wished that. They did not murder They did not murder my father. It was the forces of evil and darkness and fear who gave my father into the hands of the villagers, and gave the villagers a scaffold upon which to hang them." Then Nicholas put back his head and laughed longer and louder than ever before. "Do you want, then, to destroy the forces of evil?" I rose. "I will destroy the forces of evil, and for that I require your help." "You will require the help of the devil himself," said Nicholas. And so Nicholas remained in the castle with me, And there the two of us walked the dark halls and read the old books, but it was Nicholas who led me onto the trail of vengeance which I thought. "Do you know what the villagers fear?" he asked me one day. "They believe that a demon haunts the castle and makes the land dark and blood-thickened, and that so long as the Lord is under this demon's claw, there will be death and destruction along the land. My father was good and kind, but he sought this demon on the hill to defeat it, and was defeated himself. And you? When I myself have found and destroyed this demon, then shall my father be revenged." "And what is your plan?" asked Nicholas. "To seek and destroy." "And who will revenge you?" asked Nicholas. "If you should perish, the demon will hold sway, and his evil will be turned loose upon the land to bring harm as he wishes." "Then I must marry," I said firmly, but Nicholas laughed. "Ha ha ha! You will really go to any length to achieve your object," he said. Then for the first time since my father's death, I rode down to the village. From the sunny windows of the houses women watched me ride by, and the men in the streets narrowed their eyes and spat in my path. On the farther outskirts of the village I dismounted, for here was the family that had brought my father's death. There had been a man to this family, a great motionless beast, and it had been he who stopped before my father and challenged the demon on the hill. When my father's sword had taken the man's life, it was witchcraft that had helped him, they cried. Not all the strength of my father's arm nor the power of his voice could avail against their cries, and here was the cottage where the man had lived, and here the very path upon which he had awaited my father, and the dirt on which he had died. I stood not knowing what I sought, and then a clear, cool laugh reached me from the cottage garden. It was a girl, young and golden-haired, and she stood watching me through the rose bushes. "You are counting pebbles," she cried, "that you stand so silent and careful. Are you counting pebbles," she cried, "that you stand so silent and careful?" I frowned. "Come here," I said. She made an insolent curtsy, with no hurrying of her steps, and came lazily through the garden gate to me. "Who are you?" I said. "Elizabeth," she said demurely. "And why do you live here?" I gestured at the cottage of the man who had killed my father. "Please, sir," she said, dimpling, "it is my father's house, and my mother's. I have no place else to live." "Your father?" "He's dead now, sir." "Are you the daughter of the man who died before the old lord of the hill?" "I am, sir." "Do you know who I am?" She glanced up at me from beneath her eyelashes. "You are the young lord, sir," she said, "and a fine figure of a man at that," and laughing she turned and ran away. I stood for a moment looking after her, and then I mounted my horse and rode back through the village up the hill. There I found Nicholas, and I told him of Elizabeth. And, "Bring her here," I said. Nicholas laughed. "I have certainly made my mind to marry," I said, and then we both laughed. So Elizabeth came to the castle on the hill. How Nicholas brought her there I never asked, nor did he tell me what he had done. I know only that one day the door of the great study fell open and Elizabeth stood before me, not laughing now, but proud and stubborn and lovely. "So you came after all," I said, genuinely pleased with my triumph. "I had little choice," she said. "You make a charming addition to our family circle here," I said. Then, furiously angry, she cried out at me, "I am here because your devil's hands brought me, and yet I am not afraid of you. Your devil's hands killed my father, and he was not afraid, and I saw your father hanged, and I was glad. Do you hear me? And I wanted nothing more than to see your whole foul line perish, and yet I was a poor woman, and could never revenge myself on you and your evil blood. But now I am here, and I think I will see you die because of it, and I defy you and your castle and your devil too." And here we will pause.